It was February of 1874. The wind howled through the crags like a banshee, gnawing at the flesh of 6 prospectors who trudged silently through the snowy wilderness. They were hungry, frozen, and very, very lost. Alferd Packer walked at the front, his eyes squinting through the snowfall that sliced the air like knives. He claimed to know these mountains, claimed he'd traveled through the Rockies before. But as each hour passed and the blizzard worsened, the truth became undeniable. They were trapped. Behind him followed 5 other men, dragging what remained of their gear: pickaxes, flour sacks, threadbare blankets, barely enough to keep a dog alive. The snow was over a foot deep now, and their trail from Bingham Canyon was long gone, swallowed by the wind. They had hoped to reach the gold fields of Breckenridge. But now survival was the only goal. The men Shannon Bell, the quietest, youngest of the group, barely 20, with eyes that looked too innocent for the West. Israel Swan, oldest, in his 60s, with a thick white beard and gentle hands. James Humphrey, a former soldier, stiff and proud. Frank Miller, German, strong as a bull, but his frostbitten feet were slowing him down. George Noon, the joker of the group. His jokes had stopped 2 weeks ago. And then, Alferd Packer, the self-appointed guide. A man with sharp eyes, a snake-like drawl, and a secret in his stare. They'd left Chief Uray's Indian camp in good spirits weeks ago, refusing the offer to stay and wait out the winter. "We'll take the shortcut," Alferd had said. "I know the land." That shortcut would soon cost 5 men their lives. Hunger 3 days into the mountains, the flour ran out. 5 days in, the snowshoes broke. 7 days in, the first man collapsed. They burned a fire using old pine branches, the last of their matches nearly spent. One of them suggested boiling leather from a saddle. They did. They chewed rawhide boots, tree bark, tobacco leaves, and finally, nothing. Their bodies began to eat themselves. Bell's cheeks sank in. Humphrey's hands trembled violently. George Noon cried when he realized he could no longer feel his legs. Alferd stared at them all. Quiet. Calculating. Madness begins. On the 9th day, Israel Swan fell behind. "Leave me," he whispered. "No," Miller shouted. "We stay together." Swan shook his head. "I've lived long enough. You go." They left him with a blanket and a handful of pine needles to chew. The next morning, his frozen body was gone. Only a trail of blood in the snow. Only Alferd Packer had gone back during the night. Fire and flesh. The next to die was George Noon. He had started babbling about candy canes and New York girls, giggling into the storm. Then he simply dropped. Alferd built a fire. Humphrey screamed when he saw what Alferd was doing with the body, but no one stopped him. Miller turned away. Shannon Bell cried silently. The smell of roasted meat filled the trees. One by one. Frank Miller died violently. Some said it was a fall. Others suspected more. Humphrey vanished that night. Only Bell and Packer remained. Bell began sleeping with the axe beside him. Alferd smiled in his sleep. The snow never stopped falling. The last night Bell had been humming a hymn when Packer woke in the night. His body lay near the fire, his face peaceful. Blood soaked the snow beside him. Alferd stood with the axe in his hand, then sat beside the fire, then roasted his last companion. He was alone. 20 days later, Alferd Packer stumbled into the Los Pinos Indian Agency. His beard was thick. His body wasn't starved. He carried a satchel. When asked what he had eaten, he said simply, "Rabbit." No one asked what kind. No one. until the bodies were found. The bodies surfaced as the snow began to melt. It was late spring in the San Juan Mountains. The trees had begun to thaw. Streams ran again. The wild returned. But the ghosts of winter still lingered in a quiet clearing near the lake fork of the Gunnison River. And that's where they found them. The people who made the discovery weren't searching for treasure or gold. They were hunting game. Ute scouts, sharp-eyed and experienced, had wandered into a clearing they didn't expect. What they saw froze them in place, even in the warming sun. A fire pit, blackened, cold, abandoned, and bones, human bones. The skulls were cracked open, the limbs stripped of muscle. The snow beneath was soaked in old, frozen blood. It was a butcher site. It was a graveyard. And it was the final camp of Alferd Packer and his 5 companions. When word reached the nearby settlement of Saguache, it spread like wildfire through dry brush. The man who had wandered into Los Pinos Indian Agency months earlier, carrying a bloody satchel and strange stories, was not just lucky. He was a monster. Alferd Packer had claimed he was the lone survivor of a tragic journey gone wrong. He said his companions had died, one by one, from cold and starvation. He said he only ate human flesh after they were already dead. He said he had no choice. But the condition of the bodies told a different story. They had not merely died. They had been hunted. Someone had split their skulls. Someone had carved the meat from their bones. Someone had salted their flesh. And that someone had walked into civilization with a full beard, a calm face, and the energy to lie. Sheriff McGraw of Saguache wasted no time. He assembled a posse and rode out to the campsite. What they saw confirmed the worst. 5 corpses, mutilated, rotting, incomplete. Shannon Bell, Frank Miller, James Humphrey, George Noon, and old Israel Swan. Each body told a tale of horror. Bell's head had been split with an axe. Miller's torso was missing large sections of muscle. Swan's legs were gone entirely. Bones had been sawed through, not broken by nature. The camp was soaked in death. But what struck the sheriff the most was the position of the bodies. They weren't scattered randomly by starvation. They were organized, lined up. One man had stayed alive long enough to do this, methodically, coldly, and only one man had returned alive. McGraw's men returned to town with a fury building in their hearts. The town buzzed with rage. This wasn't a survival tale anymore. This was murder. And Packer was gone. He had left the Indian Agency just before the scouts returned, vanished into the mountains like smoke. At first, nobody had suspected much. He said he was going east to find work. But when the bones were found, everyone realized the truth. He had been running. Back at the agency, they found what he'd left behind, a satchel. Inside was what remained of his rations. Human flesh, salted and wrapped. A thigh bone, stripped clean. Bits of muscle. A knife that had been recently sharpened. Along with the meat was a gold watch engraved with the initials of George Noon. Alferd Packer hadn't been lost and starving. He'd been feeding. The town of Saguache turned into a powder keg of anger. Children were pulled off the streets. Women wept behind shuttered windows. Men polished rifles and whispered of revenge. No one had ever seen anything like this. Not in Colorado. Not in America. The newspapers had a field day. They called him the Colorado Cannibal. Stories exploded. That Packer drank blood. That he wore the skins of his victims. That he chopped them up while laughing by the fire. The facts blurred into myth, and myth gave birth to rage. Bounties were placed. Wanted posters were printed. And still, there was no sign of him. But the world is small. even in the wilderness. 9 years later, in 1883, a sharp-eyed man in Wyoming walked into a bar and recognized the face of an old cook. His name was John Schwartza now, but the scars were familiar. The eyes, sunken and dark, the crooked nose, the voice. It was Alferd Packer, the man who had murdered and eaten 5 friends. He was arrested on the spot, and the past, buried in snow and silence, came roaring back. At the jailhouse, Packer finally spoke again. And just like before, his story changed. This time, he claimed the others had gone mad. He said Shannon Bell killed the rest of the men in a frenzy, and that he, Packer, had killed Bell in self-defense. He said he had only eaten human flesh when there was no other option. That he had cried while doing it. That it haunted him every night. But no one believed him anymore. Too many lies. Too much blood. Too much horror. The trial would come next, and with it, the most infamous sentencing in Colorado history. A judge with a scorched soul would say words that echoed across America. And in the back of the courtroom, 5 families would sit with tear-filled eyes, waiting to hear what justice would finally sound like. But for now, Packer sat in a cell, alone, with only the sound of winter wind through the bars. 5 men were dead, and the one who had walked away had only just begun to face the reckoning. When Alferd Packer was dragged back to Colorado, the mountains had not forgotten his name. 9 years had passed since he'd vanished into the wilderness after confessing to a nightmare. But Colorado had waited, like a wound that never healed. And now, justice had returned, wearing boots, carrying rifles, and riding horses that kicked up the dust of the dead. They brought him back to Saguache in chains, not because he might run, but because people wanted him dead before the law got to speak. Inside the jail, Packer sat alone, surrounded by stone walls and silent stairs. Outside, a crowd grew by the hour. Hundreds came on horseback, on foot, some carrying torches, some carrying memories. Mothers whose sons had never come home. Brothers of the butchered. Men who had once prospected side by side with George Noon, Frank Miller, Israel Swan. Now they just stared at the man who had eaten them. Someone painted "murderer" in red on the jailhouse wall. Someone else tried to break in. Sheriff McGraw stood firm. He told the town, "This man will hang, but he'll hang by the law, not by the necktie of a mob." In April 1883, the trial began in Lake City, Colorado. They had to move it far from Saguache. Too many threats, too much fury. But even in Lake City, the air was thick with tension. The courthouse was surrounded by rifles, deputies, and angry whispers. The judge was M.B. Jerry, a man with no patience for liars. And Alferd Packer, seated in front of him, had already told more than a few. The courtroom filled with faces twisted in pain. Families of the dead sat clutching handkerchiefs, photographs, and each other. Behind them, journalists scribbled. Some had come from as far as Chicago and New York. This wasn't just a murder trial. It was a horror show on public display. Packer was charged with 5 counts of premeditated murder. The prosecutor, a man named Walter Root, wasted no time. He held up bones in court. Actual human bones, cracked, butchered, sawed. "This," he thundered, "is not the work of starvation. This is the work of hunger, of a different kind." The room recoiled. They brought in the satchel, still stained, still stinking. They showed the gold watch with George Noon's initials. They brought forward witnesses who had heard Packer say, months earlier, "There's men in this group that won't last the winter." They brought the Ute scouts who had found the camp and described it like a butcher's pit. And they described the way the bodies were laid out, not scattered by chance, but by design, cleaned, carved, murdered. Then it was Packer's turn to speak. He looked pale, older now, beard grayed, eyes sunken. He began again, this time with a new story. He claimed that Shannon Bell had gone insane from hunger, that he had killed the other 4 men while Packer was out hunting, that Packer had returned, found the horror, and was forced to kill Bell in self-defense. He said he didn't want to eat flesh, but there was nothing else. He wept. He held up shaking hands. But no one in that courtroom believed a word of it. The judge's voice echoed off the wooden walls. His words would become legendary. He leaned forward, stared into Packer's soul, and spoke. "Stand up, you voracious man-eaten son of a bitch, and receive your sentence. There were 7 Democrats in Hinsdale County, but you man-eaten cannibal, you had 5 of them. I sentence you to hang by the neck until you are dead, dead, dead." Gasps filled the room. Some cheered, some cried. Packer stood silent, eyes wide, lips trembling. Justice had spoken, and it had teeth. But it didn't end there. Packer's lawyers filed appeal after appeal. Colorado had only recently become a state, and legal confusion swirled around the wording of the murder statute. The original sentence was overturned on a technicality, but the state wouldn't let him go. They retried him, this time for manslaughter. He was convicted again, sentenced to 40 years in prison, the longest sentence ever handed down in Colorado at the time. But even prison didn't erase the fear of his name. In Cannon City Penitentiary, guards refused to eat near him. Other inmates gave him a wide berth. Some claimed he talked to ghosts at night. Some said he refused to eat meat, as if haunted by what he'd done. He worked as a shoemaker, wrote letters, told stories to anyone who'd listen. He never stopped changing the details. One week, he was a survivor. Next week, a victim. But no one believed him anymore. Not even himself. Years passed. The world moved on. Colorado grew into a modern state. Trains, telegraphs, towns. But the shadow of Alferd Packer never left. He became folklore. He became fear. He became a joke in saloons and a warning told to children. In 1901, after serving 18 years, Packer was paroled. Old, broken, nearly blind. He moved to Littleton, Colorado, lived in a small cabin near a chicken farm. Strangely, people visited him. Young reporters, curious thrill-seekers. They asked him the same questions again and again, and he'd smile with false sadness and say, "I never killed nobody that didn't need killin'." In 1907, he died. No family came to the funeral, no priest. Only a single man from the local newspaper stood at his grave. They buried him in Littleton Cemetery, under a plain stone. Alferd Packer, 1852 to 1907, the man-eater. Years later, someone would sneak in at night and carve one extra word into the tombstone. Repent. But the land never forgot. The wind still howls through the San Juan Mountains. Snow still covers the place where the 5 men died. Some say their bones are still there, hidden deep beneath the pines. Some say Packer's ghost walks that path, cold, starving, muttering lies. And some say, in the darkest nights, when the snow falls hard, you can still hear the crackle of a fire and the sound of chewing.